The President's press conference from the State Department Auditorium in Washington, D.C., February 14th, 1963.
Afternoon. I have a preliminary statement. I've sent to the Congress today a special message on legislative measures affecting our nation's youth, stressing in particular the administration's bill to promote youth employment opportunities. This measure, which I hope will be among the first to be considered by both houses, is urgently needed. The number of young people in the potential labor market age group will increase in this decade nearly 15 times as fast as it did in the 1950s. 7.5 million students are expected to drop out of school during the 60s without a high school education, entering the labor market unprepared for anything much other than unskilled labor. And there are fewer of these jobs all the time. Young men and women no longer in school constitute already 18% of our total unemployment, although they comprise only 7% of the labor force. These figures reflect a serious national problem. Idle youth on our city streets create a host of problems. The Youth Employment Opportunities Act will give many thousands of currently unemployed young people a chance to find employment, to be paid for their services, and to acquire skills and work experience that will give them a solid start in their working lives. Yes.
When you submitted your tax plan in the 1964 budget with its 11.9 deficit, you anticipated a certain amount of resistance to it, and Walter Heller, however, says that some of this opposition comes from what he calls the basic Puritan ethic of the American people. Do you think the time has come to abandon or at least update this Puritan ethic he speaks of?
No. I think that people are concerned about the size of the debt, and I am, and I think they're concerned about the deficit, and I am. But what I'm most concerned about is the prospect of another recession. Now, a recession is what would give us a massive deficit. I've already pointed out that in 1958, President Eisenhower thought he was going to have a $500 million surplus. At the end of the 1958 recession, he had a $12.5 billion deficit, the largest peacetime deficit in the history of this country. We had another recession in 1960, which also increased our deficit. Now, we've had a increase since the winter of 1961 in our economy. I am anxious, however, not to see us slide into another deficit. 1958, another recession. 1958, a recession. 1960, a recession. The large deficit will come if we move into another recession. And in my judgment, the best argument, and the one which was most effective as far as I was concerned, was that the reduction in taxes was an effort to release sufficient purchasing power and was an effort to stimulate investment so that any downturn in business would be lessened in its impact and could be possibly postponed. Now, if we don't have the tax cut, it substantially, in my opinion, increases the chance of a recession, which will increase unemployment, which will increase the size of our deficit. So that's what it comes down to. And I think that with the record we've had in the last 5 years of over 5% unemployment, 2 recessions, I think the important thing for us to do is prevent another one. And therefore, I think the tax cut should be looked at not as a method of making life easier, because if that were the only issue, I think we would all be willing to pay our taxes to keep our economy going. But the tax cut argument rests with the desire to stimulate the economy and prevent a recession, which will cost us the most domestically, internationally, on our budget and on our balance of payments.
Mr. President,
yes.
In connection with the review of U.S. policy toward Europe, I wonder if you're even thinking about cutting down on the number of troops in Europe or adopting any measures of economic or political reprisal against President de Gaulle.
No, in answer to your second question, definitely not. In answer to the first question, as you know, we have withdrawn over a period of some months some logistic forces, but we've kept our combat troops constant, and in addition, their equipment has been improved. We still have our 6 divisions and plan to maintain them until there is a desire on the part of the Europeans that they be withdrawn. And we've had no indications from any country in Europe that there is such a desire. If there was, of course, we would respond to it. They are there to help defend Europe and the West, not because we desire to keep them there for any purpose immediately of our own.
Mr. President, back on taxes. I realize it's too quick to make a precise reading on the fate of your tax reform and tax cut bill in the Congress, but there seems to be unusual resistance not only to the tax reform, but several senators and congressmen are telling reporters that their constituents show a resistance to tax cuts. And then today the administration received another setback in the defeat of the attempt to increase the size of the Senate Finance Committee. Taking all these things together, could you give an assessment of how you think the bill is going to do? And secondly, could you say whether you think it may be necessary for you to carry the problem to the people directly in a series of speeches or something of that kind?
Well, I think it's a hard fight. The tax reform cuts across some of the most dearly held rights of any of our citizens. Some of them have been written into law, partly as a balance to rather high tax rates, in fact, very high tax rates. It's hard to get them changed. Tax reform is, of course, a wonderful principle, but when you begin to write it in detail, it becomes less attractive. But we are talking about a $13.5 billion tax cut with about $3 billion to $300 million, which would be recouped by the reform. In addition, we would find ourselves with a better balanced tax system and one which would be more effective for the economy. If we're not able to get the tax reform which we had suggested, there probably would be adjustments made in the overall reductions. But I must say, I recommend this because I think it's in the best interest of the economy of the country. In 1954, there was a tax reduction. Within a year, the economy had been sufficiently stimulated that there were higher revenues at the lower tax rates than there had been the year before. We have a tax system that was written, in a sense, during wartime to restrain growth. Now, if you continue it, this country will inevitably move into a downturn. And I would think our experience of 58 and 60 indicates that something has to be done. And in my opinion, the most effective thing that can be done at this time is our tax program. Now, those who are opposed to the tax program should consider what the alternative is. And I think it's a restricted economic growth, higher unemployment. If we fail to do something about unemployment and begin to move into a downturn, higher unemployment, there'll be increased pressures for 35-hour week as a method of increasing employment. And I think it would be far more costly in the long run to the government and to the economy to defeat our bill. I think it ought to be approached that way. What alternative does anyone have for increasing and maintaining economic growth in view of the large deficit of 1958, in view of two recessions in 1958 and 1960? Our plan to prevent a recession this year and in the years to come is our tax bill. And I think the Congress, I hope the Congress will adopt it. And I think the country and those who oppose it should consider very carefully what they will have as far as economic growth for this country if it is defeated. Now, we're going to take it to the people, as I am today and on other occasions, and do the best we can.
Mr. President, a number of Republicans questioned the qualifications of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr. to be Undersecretary of Commerce. Would you like to answer them?
Yes, they questioned the qualification of his father to be president, and I think that Mr. Roosevelt, I'm hopeful, will be confirmed. I wouldn't have sent him up there unless I felt that he would be a good undersecretary. I served with him in the Congress, and I'm for him strongly. I hope the Senate confirms him. Yes.
Secretary, there's been a great deal of talk in Europe and here about interdependence and about partnership. Is this government at the stage of making the decision, in fact, to share command and control of nuclear forces with our European allies?
We are, as you know, putting forward and have suggested a multilateral force as well as a multinational force, which will, I think, substantially increase the influence that the Europeans have in the atomic field. It is a very difficult area because the weapons have to be fired in 5 minutes. And who is going to be delegated on behalf of Europe to make this judgment? If the word comes to Europe that, or comes any place that we're about to experience an attack, you might have to make an instantaneous judgment. Somebody has to be delegated with that authority. If it isn't the President of the United States, in the case of the strategic force, it will have to be the President of France or the Prime Minister of Great Britain or someone else. And that is an enormous responsibility. The United States has carried that responsibility for a good many years because we have placed a major effort in developing a strategic force. I said in my State of the Union address that we put as much money into our strategic force as all of Europe does for all of its weapons. Now, it's quite natural that Western Europe would want a greater voice. We are trying to provide that greater voice through a multilateral force. But it's a very complicated negotiation because, as I say, in the final analysis, someone has to be delegated who will carry the responsibility for the alliance. We hope through the multilateral system, through the multinational system, that we can provide Europe with a more authoritative position, a greater reassurance that these weapons will be used with care for the defense of Europe. I'm hopeful that the negotiations which will be carried out by Mr. Merchant will have that effect. But I think we deal, because of the time problem, which I just mentioned, we deal with a very difficult problem.
Would you expect to have the U.S. position clarified and nailed down before the NATO ministers' meeting in Ottawa in the spring?
Yes, that's right. Mr. Merchant will be going ahead in about 10 days and begin discussions in Europe of a more detailed kind. I just want to point out that because of the enormity of the weapon and because of the circumstances under which it might be fired, there is no answer which will provide reassurance under the most extreme conditions for everyone. We feel that, however, that with what we now have and what we're ready to propose, carrying out the Nassau proposal, that additional assurances can be given which we believe which we hope will satisfy the Europeans. Now, if it doesn't, then we'll be prepared to consider any other proposal that might be put forward. But in the case, for example, of France, we're not talking in that case of a European nuclear force, we're talking about of a French nuclear force. So that to make it a European force would require substantial political developments in Europe. That time might come, and if it does, we'd be glad to consider joining with them or cooperating with them in any system which they wish to develop.
President, there are reports from London that the United States and the Soviet Union are about to resume discussions on a Berlin settlement. What could you tell us about this?
No conclusion has been reached on that as to whether, as you know, we've had a series of talks over the last 2 years which have not been promising enough to lead to negotiations. And we have had no decision has yet been reached by the alliance as to whether exploratory talks will be resumed, or whether the conditions will be such that they would have some hope of advancing the common interest. So in answer to your question, this matter has not been determined.
Mr. President?
Yeah.
What do you consider the major problems and their priorities right now within the Atlantic Alliance in view of General de Gaulle's veto?
Well, there's the military problem, which we've just discussed, and also economic problems. Those are the two, and they're both important. And I would not rate a priority. Economic problems, maintaining trade, maintaining a cohesive economy between the Western Europeans and ourselves, providing for development of orderly markets, and perhaps most important, providing some better opportunity for the underdeveloped countries which supply the raw materials, who have seen their commodity prices drop in the last 3 years and the cost of the goods they buy go up. So I would say that those are the problems that I would say that are immediately before the community. Yes.
President, sir, on the NATO matter, I wonder if you could comment on General Norstad's suggestion that an executive committee be established within the NATO Council, which would have the power to decide, perhaps by a majority vote rather than a unanimous one, on the use of nuclear weapons.
Yes, I think that we ought to consider that. As you know, General de Gaulle has not been prepared to discuss a multinational force. If he was, we'd be prepared to discuss General Norstad's proposal. General Norstad's proposal, however, might not reach the needs of those countries which are not nuclear powers. But if the European countries chose to delegate their authority to General de Gaulle or to Prime Minister Macmillan, we would certainly be prepared to discuss General Norstad's proposal. But we are talking about, when we talk about Europe, we have to realize there are a good many countries of Europe, some of which are nuclear, and some of which are non-nuclear. And the question always is whether the arrangements between the nuclear powers will meet the genuine needs of the non-nuclear powers, or whether they're going to have to go the national deterrent route. which we believe would be both expensive and dangerous.
President, the Special Security Committee of the Organization of American States has reported that the present military situation in Cuba now constitutes a much more serious threat to the peace and security of the American republics than it did when this committee was authorized at Punta del Este in last January, a year ago. In view of that, I wonder if there's anything you have in mind that these American republics could and should be doing at this time to meet that threat in a collective way.
I think the part of the report which is most significant is the emphasis they put on subversion in the continent, the movement of men and perhaps money against the constituted governments. That is a matter which the United States government is giving its greatest attention to this winter. The question of the lessening not only subversion that may come from Cuba, but from other parts of the hemisphere. And I consider that our primary mission for the hemisphere this winter.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Sir, before the Cuban shipping orders were issued, there was quite a discussion about our pleas to our allies to have their shipping companies not let themselves be used as vessels to carry goods from Soviet Russia to Cuba. But when your shipping orders came out, there was no mention of penalty or policy on that. Will you tell us why you
There's been
did
a substantial reduction. I think the number of free world ships going into Cuba in January was about 12, so that our order has just gone out. There's been about a 90% drop in free world trade in the last 2 years to Cuba. Free world trade in Cuba, that's Latin America and Western Europe and ourselves, was about 800 million. 2 years ago, it's down to 90 million. I think it's going to be reduced further. Our proposals have just gone into effect, but there's been a substantial reduction in free world shipping to Cuba. In the month of January, as I said, it amounted to only 12, and it's steadily declining.
Mr. President, last weekend, the Republican leadership turned upon the administration an argument that you very effectively used in the 1960 campaign, that the prestige of the United States abroad had fallen. You were able to substantiate those charges by citing polls taken by the Eisenhower administration. What do you think of these charges, and are polls now being taken?
USIA takes surveys on the standing of what they think of the United States, or what they may think of the president, or what they may think of us technically, and all the rest in different groups. One of the reasons I was able to speak with some confidence of the reduction in Castro's standing was that other governments in the hemisphere have taken studies, surveys, and made them available to us. I think that we have difficulties because, of course, as Winston Churchill said, the history of any alliance is the history of mutual recrimination among the various people. So there's bound to be difficulties. But I think that the United States is known to be a defender of freedom and is known to carry major burdens around the world. Now, so we'll have to wait and see both what our prestige is abroad and at home. We'll get clearer ideas, I think, in the next 2 years.
Governor Rockefeller has been attacking you more and more vehemently, giving rise to the suspicion that he wants to be the Republican candidate next year. Is he the man that you think you'll be running against?
No, well, I do think that I've felt the same suspicion, and so that whether he'll be successful or not, I think only time, that's a judgment that the Republicans will have to make. I think that all these discussions of our policies and criticisms can be very useful, but I feel that we should put forward some alternative proposals, number one. Number two, whenever the United States has a disagreement with a foreign country, I think it's a mistake to always assume that the United States is wrong, and that by being disagreeable to the United States, it's always possible to compel the United States to succumb. One of the results of that has been that the United States is paying the major bill all around the world for a good many activities that serve the interests of others besides ourselves. So that I think we have to realize that we're going to have disagreements. They go to the heart of the alliance and the purposes of the alliance. They all involve the security of the United States. Those questions which involve disagreements on the atom, which were mentioned earlier, are very important questions. There's bound to be differences of opinion, and there should be, because, as I say, they involve life and death, so that we're not involved in an empty argument about nothing. Now, in addition, these arguments come more frequently when the danger, outside danger, decreases. There isn't as much of a overt Soviet military threat to Berlin now as there was some months ago. Whatever success we may have had in reducing that threat, of course, we pay for it by increased problems within the alliance. But if the threat comes again, the alliance will join together. But I think we just have to make up our mind that we have paid an enormous bill in the last 15 years, amounting to billions of dollars. We pay today, the United States, 6 divisions in Western Germany. The other countries have 1 or 2 or 3. We pay a large share of foreign assistance. Other countries pay much less. Our bases overseas, about which there's been some argument, they're there to serve to protect Western Europe. We don't mind paying for them, but we would like to at least have it recognized that the primary beneficiary may be those who are closest to the Soviets. So I expect there are going to be these disagreements, but that's because we're moving into different periods. And it's partly because some of the outside military dangers which so threatened us just a short while ago have become lessened. They may come up again, but for the period now, we're enjoying the luxury of internal dissension.
President, most of the Cuban dialogue has been confined to military personnel and military operations. Does the government have any information on the nationals of the Soviet bloc who may be in Cuba to train the Cubans in sabotage and subversion and political penetration of the Latin American countries?
I'm sure that among the technicians or military people there, or paramilitary, there are those who are participating in that kind of training, and that's why we are anxious that to stop the flow in and out of those who may be the beneficiaries of those studies.
Do you have any idea of the number or any idea how we can stop them?
Well, the problem is to get the cooperation of other Latin American countries in limiting the flow in and out, which might amount at schools, colleges, which also includes political indoctrination. I think there were 1,200 students in Latin America that went into Cuba last year. That I'm sure a good many of them were politically indoctrinated. Some of them obviously were given training in more direct forms of political action. I don't think we should regard, however, the communist threat as primarily based on Cuba, the communist threat to the hemisphere. There's a good deal of, there's a local communist action unrelated to Cuba, which continues and which feeds on the hardships of the people there, northeast Brazil and other places. So that Cuba is important, but even if we're able to stop this kind of traffic, we will still deal with the native communist movement.
Mr. President, could you elaborate a little on an earlier answer, or earlier statement you made in connection with the control of the multinational nuclear force? You seem to stress the time element of 5 minutes, perhaps, to make a decision. Isn't this force essentially to be a submarine or seaborne force, and isn't one of the beauties of this kind of a force that you don't have to come to a quick decision?
Yes, but there's still the need for relatively quick time, so that I think you're still dealing, you may not be dealing in every case with 5 minutes, but you're dealing with very difficult to hold a vote of all the members of NATO and take a majority vote on firing these missiles. What we hope to do is to indicate guidelines for any action which a commander might take, which will give assurance to the Western Europeans. Our feeling is very strong that they have that assurance now. The presence of 400,000 American troops and their families in Western Europe, people who we would not permit to be overrun, I think is a testament to our determination to honor our commitments. In addition, the very obvious fact that Western Europe is essential to the security of the United States. The loss of Western Europe would be destructive to the interests of the United States. So we feel that there is no question that these weapons would be used to protect the security of Western Europe. General de Gaulle has said that monopoly always serves those who benefit from it. I don't think that we alone benefit from it. I think Western Europe benefits from the enormous effort which Americans have made. However, if these two factors, the presence of our troops and our security guarantees, are not good enough, we hope to be able to work out devices which will give a stronger participation to the Europeans and therefore strengthen their sense of participation and their common sense of allegiance to the NATO cause which we share. I must say, in looking at the dangers we face, I put dangers in other areas to be higher than the prospect of a military attack on Western Europe. But Western Europe's the one who lives under the gun, and we are going to do everything we can to work out devices which will increase their sense of security.
You were speaking a few moments ago about paying bills. I wonder if there is anything that you believe we could or should do to stop paying for farm aid to Cuba and the publication of pro-communist propaganda through the United Nations, as we've recently learned we may be doing.
Well, I don't think that we're not going to put any money into the program in Cuba. It's not going to be any United States dollars go in that program. Now, on the book, as I understand, the book was published a year ago. There was a book written by an American group, and it was balanced off by a book written by a communist. The Soviet Union are members of the United Nations. It's difficult to prevent their participating in some of these programs unless you broke the United Nations and the bloc withdrew. So you're going to have some case of the kinds described. We try to minimize them, but quite obviously they are members, they pay, they receive. But I don't think the book, which I understand came out a year ago, it doesn't seem to me that I think we're going to survive the book.
To get back to our problems with our allies, it would seem in a way that President de Gaulle's intention to develop France's own nuclear capability and his recent pact with Chancellor Adenauer would meet in perhaps rather a perverse way, and certainly not as you envisioned it, our desire to begin withdrawing from Europe and having Western Europe assume more of its own defense. I'd like you to comment on that. And also, I understand that the Department of Defense is studying a new proposal whereby servicemen will go overseas for 1 year without their families, both to Europe and all over the world. Would you comment on that too, please?
Yes, I don't think that, and certainly the speeches in the German Parliament last week, speeches subsequent to the Franco-German treaty, indicated that the Germans felt that their security could be guaranteed without the presence of the United States. If they felt that, then our purpose in being in Europe would be ended, and of course we would want to withdraw our forces. But as long as Western Europe does not feel that their security can be guaranteed without the presence of the United States will stay. And we hope that we will be able to work in cooperation on other matters. Now, we'll have to wait and see. We are attempting to develop means of cutting our dollar losses. As I said a year ago, there are $3 billion a year, our balance of payments losses, because of our security commitments overseas. We're trying to cut them. But we'll announce it if we're going to go into a plan such as you suggested.
Mr. President, can you tell us on taxes again, are you satisfied with the support that you've gotten from the business community on the tax bill so far?
Well, as you know, the Chamber of Commerce wants a tax cut, but they want it in the higher income areas. And in addition, they're opposed to the reforms we suggested, because some of them remove loopholes, which means, of course, others have to pay. But I think at least they do support a tax cut. I think out of the Committee on Ways and Means, we're going to get a bill for a tax reduction, which will provide a consensus. It won't be perhaps the bill we sent up, but I think it will be a good bill. And I think the more people look at the alternative, I think the more general support we'll get.
Mr. President, back on the subject of American troops in Europe, the Pentagon on Monday and Tuesday knocked down stories that there were plans to withdraw some American troops from Europe. On Wednesday, it announced that 15,000 had already been pulled out. What I'd like to know, sir, is why was this withdrawal done secretly? And also, if you could expand some on your plans with respect to the shape of the American forces in Europe.
I don't think well, the best of my knowledge, I'm not familiar with the event you described. It wasn't intended to be secret. It's been going on for some months. It's a lessening of the number of logistic forces there, particularly those that were built up during the summer of 1961 at the subsequent to the Vienna meeting. But we have not at all lessened the number of our combat troops. As I've said, the United States has 6 divisions with the best supporting equipment of any of the divisions on the Western Front. According to the NATO studies, our forces are more equipped to fight, can fight quicker, with better equipment for a longer period than any other forces on the Western Front. That will continue to be true. Some countries, France has only a division and a half in West Germany, and it's quite close to the French border. Ours are further ahead, and ours can fight for quite a number of days, so that we're keeping our strength in Western Europe. In fact, we are stronger than we were a year ago, and It was not intended to be in any way a private withdrawal, which is impossible anyway. Yes.
Mr. President, you spoke of dangers in other areas. Do you consider dangers developing in Southeast Asia as a result of the proposed formation of Malaysia? This has brought Britain is relinquishing its colonial ties here.
Yes, that's correct. We've supported the Malaysia Confederation, and it's under pressure from several areas, but I'm hopeful that it will sustain itself because it's the best hope of security for that very vital part of the...
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.